Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Jimenez, and I'm the Director of Standards and Accountability at the Center for American Progress. Thank you for joining the fifth and final virtual chat series on a quality education for every child. I'm joined by three panelists to discuss the question of federal investments in public schools. We have Jessica Fauntleroy, a parent and acting chairperson of the Parent and Community Advisory Board of Baltimore City Schools. She is also a licensed clinical social worker, author of several books, and a blogger. Next, we have Cortez Moss, a former teacher and principal from Mississippi, who has also worked at the state level and is currently earning his doctorate. Then we have Emily Laidlaw, who is the policy director for Governor Whitmer of Michigan. And finally, we have Scott Sargret, vice president of the K-12 education policy team here at CAP. Today's topic is especially timely because as schools scramble to provide education and needed services to students as the entire country shelters at home, we are now seeing two things. The first is the critical role that schools play in society and in children's lives. The second is the heroic efforts schools undergo every day to provide services when they have been starved of resources for decades. The heavy reliance on state and local revenue for public education has resulted in deep inequities in funding levels among states, districts, and schools. These funding gaps are made worse by economic events like the Great Recession of 2008 and the looming recession as a result of COVID-19. As an actor uniquely positioned to provide stable and targeted investment, the federal government must take a bigger role in providing funding for K-12 schools. But I would also like to acknowledge that part of the backdrop for our discussion today is the unrest that we are seeing, which is in direct response to the systemic racism and violence against communities of color. The deaths of innocent Black men, women, and children are far too common in this country and should never be part of our daily lives. May all of those who have lost their lives rest in peace, including Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others. I'm hopeful that education will play a critical role in achieving broader social justice. Before we begin with a moderated question and answer discussion, I'd like to share about how today's session will go. We have 1 hour total. And to begin, I'll ask each panelist to share a few thoughts about why they think there needs to be greater federal investment in education. Then we'll proceed with a moderated Q&A. After that, we'll have some time at the end to ask questions from the audience, which you can submit in 3 ways. The first is on Twitter using the hashtag QualityEdChat. The second is via email at capeventquestions@americanprogress.org. And the third is by using the questions function of this webinar. You can also use the QualityEdChat hashtag to engage in the discussion on social media. For audience members wanting live captioning, that is available at americanprogress.org/live captioning. This event is being recorded, so audience members can access that on CAP's events webpage. Let's start with Jessica, then proceed to Cortez, Emily, and Scott. Please share your initial thoughts on why you think there needs to be greater federal investment in education.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Laura. I think that there needs to be a greater federal investment in education, particularly at this time, due to the financial, psychological, social, and of course the educational impact that COVID-19 has had all over the country, but particularly in communities of color, where parents and community members have been disproportionately impacted and infected by COVID-19, while already contending with the impact of generations of inequitable education funding in their school communities.
I'd love to build on Jessica's thoughts there. What we've consistently found and what we must own, I think, in this work is that schools have never been funded in the way that they need to be funded. And so when you compound a pandemic that has asked folks to, or forced folks, if you will, to leave their respective jobs and to have to find additional work, particularly parents who are at home. When we talk about a greater federal investment, I think about parents first who were working the 9-to-5 job making $8 an hour or $9 an hour who can't go in and do that work. And now they're at home responsible for being able to feed their children. We need additional funds rolling the school districts to be able to support the feeding of children, to be able to support access to broadband internet. What we've consistently found in rural communities is that even in those places where parents and children have access to the internet, it's not enough. It's still dial up in many cases. And so when we talk about a federal investment, I think that's important. And some economists have projected that we're going to see about a 30% loss in education funding. So thinking about a system that was already underfunded, now you're asking them to take a 30% cut to what wasn't enough already. And so I just believe that our policymakers need to think deeply and make an investment quick because time is running out and we shouldn't continue to ask children to wait for us to get it right.
Thank you for having me. I'm Emily Laidlaw. I'm Governor Whitmer's policy director. We have had the opportunity to have several adequacy studies done in Michigan, which looked at whether or not Michigan was doing its job in funding students where they are. And what we found is that we are seriously underfunded, and that most studies recommend implementing a weighted foundation, which would include funding students for additional needs such as poverty, special education, English language learners, and other additional funds. Michigan's tax revenue is simply not enough to cover the cost to ensure students are receiving the amount that they need based on these research studies. Governor Whitmer in her last budget made inroads to implement a weighted foundation, but in order to fully implement, we would need additional federal dollars. COVID-19 has only made this job more difficult for the reason that Cortez outlined with additional needs for broadband, but we can also look at that as a new opportunity for federal investment into the states.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be on this panel with a number of folks who are really close to the ground and doing the work in communities and states. And so just really excited to be part of this discussion and would echo a lot of what folks have already said. I think right now, the sort of clearest reason that we need much more federal investment is that because of COVID and the economic crisis, state budgets are just decimated. And all three folks have sort of talked about this, but we're looking at potential almost $800 billion shortfall in state revenues across the country over the next few years, more than in the Great Recession. There are additional costs, like Cortez and Emily have said, around reopening, around recovery, all the things that are going to happen next year. And the federal government just has to be the backstop to prevent some of the drastic cuts and harm to students and families that could come from this. I also think that there are a few reasons just broadly that the federal government has to play a greater role. And one is that education is a national priority, and that strong education system is foundational to our country. And the quality of your schools shouldn't depend on what state you live in, what city you live in. And so the federal government has to play a key role. And right now, the federal budget doesn't make education a priority. And the federal government spends about 3% of its budget on education. So we need to make sure that our budgets show our priorities. And if we care about education, then the federal government needs to invest more. The second piece is that I think it's pretty clear now that money matters in education. And there's a long debate about this, but the research is becoming clearer and clearer that particularly for students from families with low incomes, more investment does make a difference. It leads to better outcomes. It leads to better outcomes in school, it leads to better outcomes out of school, after school, in the workforce. And when we have things like the Great Recession, the current recession, or policy choices that lead to disinvestment, that leads to worse outcomes for students. The third piece is that I do think that the federal government is the only place that we can address some of the longstanding inequities in our funding system. It's really hard for states and school districts to do this on their own, and the federal government needs to lead the way in equitable funding that's targeted at these long under-resourced communities. It's communities with families with low incomes, Black and brown communities, Native communities across the country that have been historically disinvested in. The federal government has to play a bigger role in directing resources and really leading the way on this.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. So building off of what we heard a number of you say, starting at that state level, Emily, I'd like you to respond first and then get some thoughts from Jessica on this. At the state level, what has it been like trying to provide adequate education funding? And more specifically, what expectations should be set for districts for how they use those dollars to provide quality educational experience? And what do state leaders need from federal policymakers right now during the COVID-19 response and recovery, but also in the long term? And then to tack on to that, how is research on topics like learning loss and trauma playing a role in defining what schools provide to students right now?
All right, thank you. Well, I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the pandemic has really exacerbated what we've seen across Michigan. So we are expecting that existing inequities will be increased by the pandemic, and the digital divide won't help students that don't have access to devices or broadband. They'll fall further behind than other students. In the short term, Michigan and other states need flexible funding. Right now, 56% of our budget goes to local governments and schools. So facing such a shortfall, it will be hard for us to navigate around some of those core services. We are fortunate in Michigan as well. We're located in Lansing, right near Michigan State University, and we have a very tight-knit university community. That community has been pairing with teachers and also districts to talk about what does learning loss look like? What is the trauma that students are undergoing during this time, and what can we do together to help address these pieces? Today, we're announcing a Return to Learn Advisory Council, which will have all of those members on it so that we can have a group discussion and make informed recommendations to the governor on what we can do at the state level and also what can be done at the district level. We're a local control state, and we tend to respect the knowledge of local educators. But of course, there are some basic standards that we'll have to come up with when it comes to health, safety, and how to spend dollars, just like we always have. I think this time is a little bit different because as we're talking about opening up the economy, I don't think that we can look at the economy and schools as separate in this conversation. I was just talking to a superintendent up north Michigan today, who is the superintendent of schools, and her husband is an executive at Gerber Baby Food. And so that business holds down the community while she is leading the schools. So they work hand in hand. So we're really trying to bridge that divide between small business, large business, and school community and local governments.
I think that, first of all, in order for districts to come up with expectations for how to provide a quality educational experience for students, after COVID and funding and things like that, that districts need to include parents and community members at the table when it comes to policy building and new operations planning, reopening plans, because parents and families are the people that are going to have to help children move forward after this pandemic when it comes to their education. state leaders need to go to the federal government with the input from families and teachers and school leaders and district leaders and state leaders about the things that they've seen and about how these things have impacted students to get the funding that is necessary to assist our students where they are. Emily talked about the achievement gaps and learning slide and digital divide. When it comes to COVID-19, these things have become even more apparent because we have children, I know here in Baltimore, who did not have computers up until about last week. Our school district, we was able to give computers to families, but some students still have not been able to get online. So they've lost, a couple of months of reading and math education. And so districts are now working together, district is working together to try to find out, how can we assist students when schools do finally reopen to be able to recover some of the, learning that they've lost during this period due to things that are outside of their control. And so, this discussion should definitely focus on working with families about how to move forward, helping them to go to their local district, to their state leaders, and the state leaders to go to the federal government about what they've learned and have families at the table, and planning for our future after COVID.
No,
Thank you both. And please, Cortez, I'd love for you to, if you could respond to what Emily and Jessica raised, that'd be wonderful.
yeah, thank you so much for bringing us to the conversation, Laura. One of the things that we have found since the distribution of CARES dollars is, and let me frame this and say, while we're excited that the CARES dollars got directly to school districts, what we found is the funding that the state was able to set aside from the CARES fund is not really enough to have a comprehensive effort towards reforming any systems or providing a state level support. And to Emily's point, when state budgets are already stressed, state superintendents of education and commissioners are having to ask the legislature for additional money to have a comprehensive plan. Let me give you an example and I'll stop. We actually need a comprehensive effort in Mississippi to put a device in every child's hand. And our commissioner has made a commitment to being able to do that. The only way that we're able to do that financially is that we pull all CARES dollars together and get districts to commit to being able to do that. Well, you might imagine Superintendent Z is not willing to give of his CARES dollars because he has actual needs in his school district, and I can't be upset with him about that. And so the little funding that we did get from CARES has not been enough to have a comprehensive approach to really putting systems and structures in place to ensure that every child is learning and that they have what they need. And so we need another round of CARES dollars. And we need to actually be able to give DOEs more money to be able to implement a comprehensive plan, because what's happening now is further exacerbation of inequities, because you might have money in your local school district in Z to do other things with because you already have laptops. But Superintendent A, who didn't have a laptop for every child, can't do that now. And so we really need a greater investment from our federal government as regard to building a comprehensive plan to dealing with the challenges that we see as a result of COVID-19.
I would just say, I agree with everything everyone has already said. I'm really glad, Emily and Jessica, you both particularly brought up the role of local communities in determining what this recovery strategy looks like. I think that's incredibly important and something that the federal government could take some lessons from too, and how to listen to folks closer to the ground in developing policy. And one thing I would just add is I think that we've been thinking about a few different buckets of assistance that state and local governments really need from the federal government. So first is around the immediate crisis response. And so this, I think, was part of what the CARES Act was intended for, and some of the even earlier response bills from Congress, that there, as schools were starting to close, districts needed to figure out, at least initially, what some of the remote learning strategies would be, figure out how to get students with disabilities, special education services in a remote environment, and how to coordinate with health officials, those sorts of things. Now we're in kind of a second phase where federal government needs to provide this kind of state stabilization funding to really fill the budget holes and make sure that schools can reopen, to make sure that they can do that kind of comprehensive planning that Cortez, you were talking about, and sort of move into next year without the worry of facing another shortfall like the Great Recession. And then the third piece is, even beyond the stabilization, next year and the next few years, there's going to be enormous needs around recovery. And I think the federal government needs to think about what it would mean to, say, increase Title I funding, IDEA funding, funding for English language learners. There's a whole host of programs that are intended to support students that there's just going to be such immense need next year and the following year and sort of even beyond. And so how can there be a federal role in that recovery to make sure that we're not in a place in 2 years or 3 years where we've lost so much learning and so much support for students?
Great, thank you. The needs are going to be so great for an extended amount of time that it really is critical that the federal government plays a much bigger role in the immediate response, the stabilization, and eventual recovery. All right, let's move on to the next question. This is, I'd like for Cortez to start the response on this, then Jessica, Scott, and Emily. What do you wish policymakers knew or saw about the impact of years of underfunding education? And what has it meant for schools and students and educators and parents?
I think this is, Laura, I think this is an excellent question. And there's so much that I wish policymakers could see about what's happening or not happening in our schools, if you will. I'm going to start with buildings. This is just foundational. If you could spend time across this country, particularly in the Deep South, you'll find that the buildings that we are asking children to learn in every day, we wouldn't ask, I'm sorry to say it, we wouldn't ask some animals to live there. It's really unfortunate, the places that we are asking children to walk into each day and learn. And so if policymakers could just do a tour of this country, particularly in the Deep South, and see the buildings that children are being educated in. The second thing I think is so concerning for me, in addition to buildings, last summer we had a massive rainstorm in Mississippi. And one of our state newspapers chronicled the fact that children could not move from one building to the next because flooding had taken over the infrastructure around the school. I wish policymakers could see that and could wade through that water and have to try to get to the next building. I enter many schools that don't have a Tier 1 curriculum in place. In 1954, post-Brown versus Board of Education, 1965 EA, we endeavored to essentially have accountability in place and to also look out for the underserved. That still hasn't happened. And we've gone to NCLB, we've gone to ESSA, and we still see that children don't have access to a Tier 1 high quality curriculum or a textbook in many of our schools because of years of underfunding. We've still not recovered from the 2008 recession. And I think finally, if leaders could see things across this country, we still have classrooms that do not have a teacher in this country. More profoundly and more concerning for me is that we have classrooms that are packed with children of color, or Black and brown children, if you will, and they go through their entire schooling and never see a teacher that shares their same race or identity. And so they need to see those classrooms. They need to see those buildings. They need to see the lack of access to high quality Tier 1 curriculum. And, you know, I'll just tell you one last story. I went into a bathroom in a school that was not stocked with tissue paper, which is foundational. And so I just wish these are the things that our legislators could see across the country. And I believe they would be moved to a greater federal investment. Particularly, we can't rely on state budgets to do everything for our students and kids, to do everything that's deserved to them.
Great, Jessica, if you could weigh in next.
Yes. When it comes to I wish that policymakers can see the generational impact of underfunded schools and families. So right now in our classrooms, we have students that are living in chronic generational poverty in their lives that is due to their parents being in schools that were underfunded. that their parents weren't able to obtain the educational opportunities that they should have been able to, which has caused them to not be able to get gainful employment, and which has created a persistent underclass in so many communities across our nation. And with the persistent underclass, sometimes you have quality of life issues that lawmakers end up seeing, policymakers end up seeing when it comes to criminal justice challenges. And much of that can be traced back to not being able to have the appropriate learning tools that you needed. So as an adult, being unable to obtain gainful employment, people become involved in crime and substance abuse and gambling and different things that impacts families for generations. And sometimes families are never able to recover. And when we think about how they got that way, so many times, especially with me being a social worker, you never hear people talk about the beginning of the family, which was the educational experience. Secondly, when you talk about, as Cortez spoke about, the school buildings, these buildings are in communities. So, with a school building being dilapidated, many people move into communities to purchase homes because of the schools. And if the school in the community is a dilapidated building without access to great programming for children, families will not want to move, into communities, which will bring down property values and increase vacant homes in communities. So lack of access to funded schools, it just makes a more difficult environment for families, no matter where they turn, in cities all over the country.
Thanks, Jessica. Scott, if you'd like to go next.
I can't add a ton to what Cortez and Jessica said. I totally agree with all of that. I think one other piece that I would say is that I think it's important for policymakers at all levels to understand that the underfunding of education, but also the inequitable funding, is not by accident, right? This was a set of policy choices that people have made over generations to underfund schools, and particularly to underfund schools in Black, Latino, Native, and low-income communities. And so those are choices that can be changed, and they can be changed in a number of different ways, right? And I think there are choices that have been made recently around tax cuts in the aftermath of the Great Recession. When the economy was starting to recover, some governors chose to cut taxes rather than reinvest in education. And right now, there are districts that are seceding from other school districts to protect their own property tax base and not share that funding with lower income and Black and Latino communities. So these are things that are happening now that policymakers can make different decisions about. And I think that's important, that this isn't something that happened by chance. It's not something that is unchangeable. And it's not something that is only about, oh, we just need to increase funding. We also need to make different choices about how that funding is distributed to communities.
Yep, I'll echo what everyone else has said. The bottom line is that middle and upper class families are going to make up any shortfall in the public education system, and lower income families won't be able to. So we need to adjust the system to create equity with that in mind.
I think the topic of sharing resources equitably is one that has been litigated in the courts, and is something that we just haven't solved yet. And I really look forward to seeing what the federal government can do to create more of that equity at the top level. But there's no easy answer. Okay. Next, let's stay with the topic of inequity in funding, because we know it is deeply inequitable across the country. There are large between state inequities, in addition to the inequities between districts within the same state, and then between schools within the same district. How could the federal government help address these funding inequities in particular? What could more targeted federal funding look like? Scott, I'd like to start with you, then pivot over to Emily, and then the others.
So I think this is a really important question in terms of what specifically the federal government can do moving forward. I think there are a couple of things to know at the outset. One is, Laura, like you mentioned, there are actually enormous differences in funding between states. I think we've heard a lot about differences in funding within states, so from wealthy to lower income districts, and there's research that's been coming out about the gap between predominantly white and predominantly non-white districts, and the $23 billion gap there that EdBuild has found. But I think this difference between states is a little less well known. I mean, New York as a state spends about 3 times as much per pupil as Idaho, even when you control for cost of living. And that's sort of remarkable. Some states even like Mississippi, actually, when you consider their resources that they have available at the state level, they actually spend quite a bit of that on education, but they just they can't possibly spend enough because the state as a whole just doesn't have the revenue. So the federal government needs to play a role in addressing these inequities at all levels, at the state level, at the district level, and at the school level. So I think there are a few sort of principles to maybe think about in terms of federal investment. So one is just that the federal government has to target all levels of inequity. It can't just focus on inequities across states. It can't just look at across districts. It really needs to think about how its investments can target all those levels of inequity. The second piece is that the federal government should make sure that it's targeting distribution of new investments to those districts that have the highest poverty rates, so that funding is actually allocated where it's going to expand opportunity the greatest and where it's going to lead to improvements for the most students. The federal government really can lead on equitable funding. And the third piece is that the federal government really needs to think about how to provide incentives for states to improve their funding system. So to make their own state and local funding systems more equitable and to increase their overall investment in education. And the federal government actually can provide some of those incentives in terms of the way it distributes money. And then the last piece is that for beyond the level of funding or the distribution of funding, I think that the federal government should provide some support for states to conduct basically resource allocation reviews. So how can they look explicitly at race and income equity and improve the distribution of not just financial resources, but all sorts of resources across districts? And how can the federal government provide that kind of support to take that equity lens to the distribution of these resources?
Thanks, Scott. In general, I think the role of federal funding is currently designed to serve the right one, to target and lift up low income and other high needs students. But in short, we need more of this assistance in order to better support the high poverty districts. Federal funding for Title I and IDEA has not kept pace with inflation, growing enrollment, or student needs, and IDEA funds have never been appropriated at anything close to the levels that they were authorized. This shifts the cost for educating students with special needs to states and school districts. Michigan, in one of the adequacy studies done by the last administration, they found that special education is $742 million underfunded just in Michigan. If IDEA were to be increased, it would give more flexibility to plug holes elsewhere where schools wouldn't be shifting money around to try and meet the needs of of these students with additional needs. So, you know, that's what I would say.
Cortez and Jessica, did you also want to weigh in on this in particular, those specific federal levers? Great, okay. In many places, education funding has not recovered from the drastic cuts made during the last recession. I think, Cortez, you might have been the first to make this point. How do you think this is going to impact districts during the upcoming recession, which experts are projecting is going to be a great deal worse than 2008? Are there any lessons we've learned from that last recession that education leaders should keep in mind this time? Would love for Cortez to start, then Jessica and Emily.
Interestingly, just to let us laugh a little bit, in 2008, I was graduating from high school. So I don't think we, to be honest, and I really wish I could be positive here. I don't think we learned any lessons because we have not recovered from 2008. We asked school districts, and just my understanding, we asked school districts to cut staff, and we've yet to bounce back and have the staffs that our schools need. I think if we wanted to stretch it and find a way that we learned a lesson, is we learned that we don't need to cut starting with teachers. So many school districts started out reducing units and exasperating class sizes. I think what you're hearing leaders talk about now is where can we make cuts in other places? We just convened a call with superintendents across our state last week, and one of the questions I asked them as we grapple with an additional loss in funding, because recognizing that we've not bounced back yet, where are you going to begin to make cuts? And many of them said, look, we're not going to make cuts in the classroom. And I think the data tells us that we saw too many cuts in the classroom from the 2008 recession. And so I think leaders have learned not to make those cuts. I think another lesson that we have learned and that we are slowly learning is that rather than reducing funding in early childhood education, we actually need to put more money there so that we can ensure that kids are caught up. I just heard our lieutenant governor say, look, we're going to have to make tough cuts, but we're still going to put money in early childhood education. And we weren't having that conversation in 2008, that we needed to continue putting money in early childhood education. I've also heard leaders say, look, we don't need to look to education first. In 2008, folks started looking to education first because it was the largest expenditure by most states, particularly in a place like Mississippi. It is our largest expenditure. While it's still not enough, it's one of our largest expenditures. Folks are saying, can we look other places? Our lieutenant governor first asked state agencies to cut before we started looking at education funding. And so I think the lesson that we learned is that we need to ask other folks to get a little bit more frugal in their behavior and not ask education systems to do that so quickly. There are other places that we can make cuts. And so I think those are the things that we've learned since 2008, given that we've not bounced back yet, which is what is so concerning and depressing for me, is that just at a time when states were beginning to put more money, I know in Mississippi, we just gave teachers a raise. We were committed to giving teachers another raise. We just put more money to go from 3,000 seats in pre-K to 4,000 seats in pre-K because we've not mandated it statewide. And so we were on the cusp of doing such great work in terms of expanding access and disrupting inequities from birth to adulthood. And much of that has been halted. And I think we're going to see leaders take a pause and not want to, just on a political point, many of our elected leadership that's currently in office now, they campaigned on a teacher pay raise. They campaigned on expanding access to early child education. And so I think folks weren't campaigning on those things in 2008 in the way that they are now. And so we have learned a little bit of our lesson. I was just graduating high school, so I didn't feel much of the loss, but certainly feeling it now as a millennial, if you will.
Yeah, you've certainly observed your history very well. Jessica, would love to get your response after that.
Yes, I think during the last recession, like Cortez said, when teachers were cut in classrooms, 10 years later, we're able to see the achievement gaps that still persist and how they impact our workforce. In Baltimore, we have so many people living under the poverty level because of the lack of educational opportunities that they had due to budget cuts and equitable funding from the beginning. And so it is my hope that during this time that education leaders look no further than our workforce and the need for so many unskilled jobs and then so many skilled jobs being empty because we don't have a workforce that has those skills due to our educational system. And so during this time, I'm hopeful that educational leaders keep that in mind, especially with the class of 2020 graduating, this week, and us having so many children that are going to be coming out in the next 2 years after this COVID-19 pandemic with learning loss and already dealing with an achievement gap on top of that. And so keeping in mind that they're dealing with that and not trying to have another generation that's even more further behind than the ones that we have right now and the generations before.
Thanks, Jessica. What I think you all are pointing to is that we have an opportunity to do things differently this time around because there are some lessons learned that we have to pay attention to. And we really need to take heed of those lessons. So sticking with that point, lots of education advocates are having conversations in Capitol Hill right now about a next stimulus bill. And specifically asking for that bill to include more money for states to support K-12 education and higher education. What guidance should be provided and by whom to districts and schools on how to spend those dollars most effectively to provide a high quality education to all students, but also while balancing the fiscal costs of physical distancing to reduce the spread of coronavirus. So I think we're seeing a tension of needing to provide a high quality education, but also having to do things completely differently. Physical distancing, maybe staggered scheduling, and districts and schools need guidance on how to do that. So if any of you have any thoughts about how we can get that information to them, would love to hear them. Emily, would love to hear from you in particular. What have you guys been thinking about in terms of the physical realities of opening schools with the educational needs?
Yep. So that's really, we pulled together this advisory council that's made up of parents, districts, health professionals in order to look at that. Individual school districts have costed this out and communicated with their congressional representatives, and just ending up status quo won't be enough. The states need flexible funding in order to implement health and safety and wellness, as well as offer educational opportunities. I'd also encourage leaders not to forget about the what we learned in 2008, like the housing crisis. A lot more students will be moving around, which will create additional needs and move money around the state so that districts will feel further instability. And then other things like food assistance. We have spent a tremendous amount of time well spent during COVID-19 to figure out how to get breakfast and lunch to students who qualify to ensure that no one goes hungry, and also to feed their families. So how to continue that as we're navigating hotspots that may take face-to-face learning remote and then back again. Those pieces need to be in place, and that can only be accomplished by states working together with their community members and local districts with flexible funding from the federal government.
All right, does anyone else want to respond to that?
I do.
Great.
Looking at guidance from parents, because parents are starting to go back to work, people who haven't lost their jobs altogether. And with that, parents are going to have to
Jessica, I think we lost your audio.
oh, I'm sorry. Working with parents on how to best assist them with, people are going to start going back to work soon, people who haven't lost their jobs, and families who have multiple children in K and sixth grade and staggered schedules. All of these having children in different schools that may or may not be opening, along with that another closing could come if we have a second wave. Districts and leaders have to work with families, because we are all just very concerned about how this reopening plan is going to work out, for families, and how will people still have food and access to the internet, access to computers. while still being worried about their children going back into a school building, if that is something that is possible. So working with families is going to be one of the most important parts of this planning.
Laura, I wanted to add as well, and kind of build on that. I just have to do a plug for research, because we need to get smart about what we're doing, and we need to. Kids don't have time for us to wait 6 months to figure out the best strategy for delivering blended learning. So what I think has been missing, and maybe this is part of our stabilization funds, is talking to the researchers, talking to folks who know exactly what are best practices in terms of delivering content virtually. And I think the second part of that is we need lots of training for teachers to be able to be ready to teach kids virtually. One of the things that we have not thought about, and when I worked at the DOE, thinking about human capital, I was always concerned about people who had 20 to 25 years of experience, particularly folks that had 25 years of experience, that when we made a change or when we made a shift, they could just turn in their keys and walk out the door. And we have so many educators who could retire now. And so the fear associated with having to teach online or come up with different methodologies. I think the last thing I want to think about is, since folks are so excited in this country about the word choice and we just throw it around so freely, as regards to school choice, I think public schools will now have an opportunity to give parents some choice in, like, do you want your child to come to school every day? Do you want them to have a blended learning model? Do you want them to be at home and then they just meet with their teacher online? I think we will be able to implement additional choice in our system, and we need to get that right. We don't need to do it wrong. We don't need to exasperate that. And so I think we really need to, as we set funding aside, we need to bring researchers to the conversation and think about how do we do this more. What we're also seeing is that leaders are not relying on science, and that goes to my research point and what the science is saying about opening schools. And kind of what is happening in Michigan, Dr. Wright, our state chief, recently brought together 9 superintendents across the state and said, what is your thinking for the next 3 months for getting ready to open school? And so we've chronicled their thinking, and we put that in a document to support leaders. And so we actually need to be able to create learning spaces and more documents that actually appeal to a superintendent's thinking, because we really need to build folks' intellectual capital around opening school. Because some folks are going to do it well, some are going to do it wrong. And so as much research and intellectual capital we can build broadly about opening schools driven by science and research, I think we can get it right. But you got to have funding to do that, right? The best researchers are not there. We need folks who are in schools the first week that we open, figuring out what's working and what's not working, so that we can get it right quickly.
Great, thank you. You made a point I'd like to spend some time on about having the resources to do something well. We see some examples of districts rising to the occasion right now, and some not, in terms of providing really clearly defined educational services to students. And the difference in quality isn't always about money. So Detroit, for example, which is famously underfunded, was among the first to create a really comprehensive learning plan that provided a full day of real-time instruction to students virtually, and for those who didn't have access to the internet, paper-based. What do you think makes the difference between those districts that do provide effective guidance and those that don't? And this is open to anyone.
I think, in terms of Detroit, they have a tremendous community buy-in. Superintendent Beatty and the philanthropic community, as well as local community leaders and parents, have banded together to create the change that you're seeing. And it's really wonderful and palpable to feel when you're talking with them. So I think, what we've heard today is that involving everyone creates the ability to create something successful for students.
Yes, it can't happen in a vacuum behind closed doors with just education leaders making the choices. The involvement of the community, I think, is critical. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I feel like I'm talking too much, but we found it to be not necessarily a will issue, but a skill issue. Literally, we're asking people who've never led through a crisis to lead through a crisis, and many of them are not as emotionally ipt or is not as skilled at this. And let me be frank with you, and I said this one day, we're asking people who couldn't lead in the absence of a crisis to lead in a crisis. And so some of the limited planning or the lack of planning at all is really due to some folks couldn't lead when districts, weren't in the middle of a pandemic. And so this is why I have this big push for investing in research, investing in science, and developing how-to guides. One of the things Dr. Wright is doing in Mississippi is every 3 months they're going to release what you should be thinking about as a school superintendent, from contracts all the way from contracts with vendors to having to buy laptops, procurement deadlines. There are lots of procurement laws that could prevent us from getting a laptop in the hands of every child. And so I really think it's not okay for us to assume that everybody is able and capable of leading. And so we have to be overly supportive in the development of resources and guidance for moving through this, which is what's been absent largely in this movement. The U.S. Department of Education has been completely absent as regard to supporting states and school districts with returning to school. And so in the absence of them, we need to be able to build intellectual capital so that folks can be ready to go back.
We do have some questions from the audience I'd like to ask you all. Sticking with the point that a number of you have raised throughout this discussion about getting devices, internet-connected devices to students is a clear gap that we need to address. Apart from the devices, what about internet access? Considering the infrastructure and geographic conditions across the country, especially in rural communities, there is a real digital divide. And what responsibility do companies play in bridging that divide? Because it clearly can't be something that governments can do alone. So anyone can respond to that question.
Yeah, this is a huge challenge, and I think it's around 7 million families in this country that don't have internet access and can't afford it. I mean, that's an enormous number, and it's all across the country. And it's, I think, not just an education issue; it's an economic development issue. It's a healthcare issue. As we're moving to things like telemedicine, if people don't have internet access, then they can't actually provide the things that they need to provide for their family. So I think there is a big role for government to play in this, because broadband access in some ways should be like telephone access and water and sewer and all the other things that are provided as a public utility. And there needs to be government investment. I think there's also obviously a role for companies and industry in this, but the scale of the problem is just so great. There needs to be a federal role in providing some investment here.
Great, thank you. So we've got another question from the audience. A number of you have mentioned different pots of federal funds that serve different student populations. IDEA, for example, serving students with disabilities. We have a number of these funds, including Title I for low-income students, Title III for English learners. As long as we have these segregated pots of funding, will we continue to get the same old results, meaning we kind of treat different kids differently? And what do you think that impact will have on exacerbating generational inequities?
I think this goes to Cortez's answer about research. So we've always had these pots of money, but if you use them in a way that's research backed, you'll be able to deliver the services that students need in order to succeed. So instead of using them or thinking of them as status quo or same old, think of them as resources for students to succeed. And I'd love to hear what Cortez thinks about how research and the path of money should intersect at the federal level.
Yeah, the first thing I thought about was I think it's 1975. Please don't quote me on that date. But when I go back to the law that we got, I think it was 1975, around education for handicapped children. That was the name of it at the time. I don't agree with the title now. Students with disabilities would be a better way to think about it. That law had to be put in place, not because folks weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And I think what we've seen in the history of this country is that if we don't name where the dollars have to go and we don't specialize pots of money, then it won't happen. And I think we saw that with NCLB. NCLB was very rigid and told folks what they had to do. Then we got ESSA, and it lended itself to more flexibility for states. But I really believe, and just what I've seen over time, is that we need to stay married for the sake of equity to these pots of money. Because if we lump it all together, you are giving an individual who comes to this work with bias, with an incredible amount of bias. We all have bias, an opportunity to dismiss a population of students, and they may never get the funding that they deserve. So I hope I answered your question with regard to why it's important to have certain pots of money. Even with the presence of a law, we've not done well with money. So I scream and I cringe at the thought of no accountability with regard to how we should be spending dollars and allocating funds specifically for Title I children, or allocating funds specifically for English language learners in our Title III dollars. We're still not getting that right with Title III dollars. With the limited guidance that we have, many of our English language learners are sitting in classrooms on Rosetta Stone when they deserve a dual language classroom or a teacher that speaks their language fluently. And so I think we have to prioritize funding in this way to deliver on a commitment to equity, because in the absence of that, leaders get to pick and choose what they want to fund. Emily,
Anyone else want to respond to that?
Emily?
Okay, great. We've got 1 minute left. I've got one question from the audience. This person has seen the impacts of poor construction in schools. Specifically, a floor was sweating in a building because of the poor construction underneath. So how can districts getting this influx of money ensure that what they're getting back from services are high quality, especially when it comes to school infrastructure? Emily, I'm going to pivot that one to you.
All right. You know, I think we have, with the state, relationships with contractors, and we have quite a robust fire safety and construction code unit. I don't know much more than that about school construction, but I would hope that schools in Michigan, if they are building, would utilize those services, not as regulatory hoops, but as you know, to make sure that they're making a good investment, and staff, students, parents will be safe in those buildings.
Yes, I think the tension between flexibility of funding with accountability for how those dollars are spent it's a real tension. All right, everyone, we have hit time. Thank you so much to the panelists and the audience for joining our final Quality Ed Chat web series. We hope this was a valuable session for you. If you'd like to access the recording of today's session, please go to CAF's events webpage. Have a great day.